In the spring of 1987, every farmer in Finney County, Kansas, knew two things about Dorothy Hassel's windbreak. It was old, and it was in the way. The cedar trees ran along the north and west edges of her 480-acre farm like a dark green wall planted by her grandfather in 1931 when the soil was still blowing off the Dust Bowl fields in sheets thick enough to bury fence posts. 56 years later, the trees stood 40 feet tall, their roots reaching down into the hardpan, their canopy blocking the afternoon light from the first 2 rows of her winter wheat. The county extension agent had told her, twice, that removing them would give her an extra 11 acres of tillable ground. Her neighbor to the north, Buck Thornton, had told her she was leaving money on the table every single year she kept them. Her father's old farm partner, a man named Gene Crowley, who ran the co-op in Garden City and had been farming Finney County ground since before Dorothy was born, had told her the same thing in different words every time he saw her. The trees, they all said, were a relic, a reminder of a different era, a problem dressed up as a solution to a problem that no longer existed. Dorothy Hassel kept the trees. Let me tell you about Dorothy Hassel because you need to understand who she was before you can understand what she did, and you need to understand what she did before you can understand why people in Finney County still talk about her the way they do. Dorothy was 24 years old in 1987. She had grown up on that farm, the third generation of Hassels to work that particular stretch of southwest Kansas ground, and she had come back to it after 4 years at Kansas State University with a degree in agronomy and a head full of ideas that nobody around her was particularly interested in hearing. Her father, Leland Hassel, was a good farmer in the way that most good farmers in Finney County were good farmers. Methodical, experienced, deeply skeptical of anything that hadn't been proven on Kansas ground by Kansas people over Kansas decades. He had farmed the same rotation for 30 years. Winter wheat in the fall, fallow through the summer, winter wheat again. He kept his equipment clean and his books tidy, and his yields were consistently in the top third of the county. He was not a man who invited change, and he was not a man who had asked his daughter for her opinion on his operation. But he was also, quietly, a man who loved his daughter and was not entirely sure what to do with her. Dorothy had come home with a notebook, not a farm notebook, not the kind her father kept, with equipment maintenance schedules and seed purchase records and fuel costs per acre. Her notebook was full of research. Soil moisture retention studies from Colorado State, wind erosion data from the USDA's Great Plains Research Station in Woodward, Oklahoma, evapotranspiration tables comparing sheltered fields to unsheltered fields across the Kansas-Colorado border. She had a professor at K-State, a man named Dr. Arvid Lindgren, who had spent 20 years studying the relationship between windbreaks and crop yields in semi-arid environments, and his data had done something to Dorothy Hassel that 4 years of farming had not been able to do to most of the people around her. It had made her certain. Let me tell you about what Dorothy's notebook said, because the science is the reason this story exists, and it is worth understanding before we get to the part where everyone laughs at her. Dr. Lindgren's research and the broader body of literature Dorothy had assembled showed several things with remarkable consistency. First, a properly maintained windbreak in a semi-arid environment reduces wind speed across a sheltered field by 30 to 50% for a horizontal distance of 10 to 15 times the height of the trees. Dorothy's cedars stood 40 feet tall. That meant her windbreak was providing meaningful wind protection across a swath of ground 600 feet wide from her north and west boundaries. Second, reduced wind speed translates directly into reduced evapotranspiration. the process by which crops and soil lose moisture to the atmosphere. In a county where annual rainfall averaged just 16 inches and where summer winds regularly exceeded 30 miles per hour, moisture retention was not an abstraction. It was the difference between a crop and a failure. Third, and this was the number Dorothy had written in red ink at the top of the first page of her notebook. Sheltered fields in semi-arid Kansas showed average yield improvements of 8 to 14% compared to unsheltered fields growing the same variety of winter wheat under the same rainfall conditions. 8 to 14%. On 480 acres at the wheat prices of 1987, that was the difference between a thin year and a comfortable one. Fourth, and this was the part that nobody wanted to hear, the 11 acres of tillable ground she would gain by removing the trees would produce, on average, less additional revenue than the yield benefit she was already receiving across the entire sheltered portion of her farm. She was not leaving money on the table. She was sitting on top of it. Her father listened to all of this at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in March of 1987. He listened the way a man listens when he is not sure whether he is hearing wisdom or foolishness and is not yet ready to decide. Dorothy's mother, Ruth, who had been washing dishes at the sink with her back to the room, turned around when Dorothy finished and said quietly, "She's right, you know." Leland Hassel set down his fork and looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he said, "I need to think about it." Which, for Leland Hassel, was not a dismissal. It was the closest thing to an open door he knew how to offer. Dorothy was not proposing to remove the windbreak. She was proposing to expand it. She wanted to plant a second shelter belt along the eastern boundary of the farm, a mixed planting of eastern red cedar, Siberian elm, and native plum that would extend the protective envelope around the farm's most productive ground. She had a planting plan drawn up, sourced through the Kansas State Conservation Commission's tree program, which provided windbreak seedlings at reduced cost. The total investment was small. The projected return, according to Dr. Lindgren's models, was significant. She also wanted to change the summer fallow rotation. Instead of leaving ground bare through the summer, she wanted to plant a cover crop of native grasses and legumes that would hold the soil and fix nitrogen and reduce the erosion that bare fallow ground was subject to every time the wind came up from the southwest in August. This was, in 1987, not a common practice in Finney County. It was, in fact, the kind of thing that made Gene Crowley set his coffee cup down at the co-op counter and look at you the way he looked at people who had said something worth correcting. Let me tell you about Gene Crowley, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he said, and you need to understand what he said before you can understand what it cost Dorothy Hassel to keep going. Gene Crowley was 61 years old in 1987. He had been running the Finney County Co-op in Garden City for 19 years, and before that he had farmed 800 acres of his own ground in the northern part of the county until a combination of the 1980 drought and a bad equipment loan had convinced him that the retail side of agriculture was more reliable than the production side. He was not a cruel man. He was a confident one, which, in the particular social ecosystem of a rural Kansas co-op, is sometimes more dangerous. He held court at the counter every morning between 6:30 and 8, and the farmers who came in for seed and chemicals and equipment parts absorbed his opinions the way dry ground absorbs rain, quickly and without much discrimination. He had opinions about varieties, about herbicide programs, about when to plant and when to wait, and his opinions were usually right, which had given them, over 19 years, the quality of fact. When Gene Crowley said something was a bad idea, It had the weight of collective memory behind it. Dorothy made the mistake, or perhaps it was not a mistake at all, perhaps it was a deliberate choice, of mentioning her windbreak expansion plan at the co-op counter on a Wednesday morning in April, when 4 other farmers were present and Gene was on his second cup of coffee. She was there to pick up a soil test kit, and the conversation had turned, as it often did in April, to the question of summer management. Someone asked Dorothy what she was planning to do with her fallow ground. She told them. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Gene Crowley started laughing. It was not a mean laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has heard something so far outside his frame of reference that his first response is amusement rather than argument. It was the laugh of a man who is certain, and whose certainty has never cost him anything, and who therefore has no reason to question it. He laughed, and then he said, "Dorothy, your grandfather planted those trees because the ground was blowing away. The ground isn't blowing away anymore. We've got conservation tillage, we've got stubble management, we've got herbicide programs that keep the ground covered. You don't need a windbreak to farm in Kansas in 1987. You need yield." He picked up his coffee cup. "And cover crops on fallow ground are going to cost you moisture. That's moisture your wheat needs in the fall. You plant grass and legumes in July, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul." The other farmers nodded, not because they had thought it through, but because Gene Crowley had said it with the confidence of a man who had thought it through, and that was usually enough. Dorothy did not argue. She had learned, in the months since coming home, that arguing with Gene Crowley at the co-op counter was not a productive use of her energy. She said, "I appreciate your perspective, Gene." And she picked up her soil test kit and she left. One of the farmers at the counter, a man named Ray Sievert, who farmed the section east of Dorothy's place, watched her go and then said to nobody in particular, "She's going to learn." Gene Crowley refilled his coffee and said, "They all do." Let me pause here and ask you something. When Gene Crowley laughed that morning, what was he protecting? He was not protecting his farm. He was not protecting his livelihood. He was protecting a picture of the world that had been built over 60 years of experience, and that had, by and large, served him well enough that he had never had to question whether it was complete. The laugh was not about Dorothy's plan. The laugh was about the possibility that someone who had been farming for less than a year, someone who had come back from college with a notebook full of numbers, might see something that 60 years of accumulated experience had missed. That possibility was not comfortable, and so it became funny instead. Dorothy drove home and told her father what had happened. Leland Hassel listened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Plant your 100 acres on the east side, the trees and the cover crop both. We'll see what the numbers say at harvest." It was not an endorsement. It was permission, offered quietly, in the way that men who are not sure they're right sometimes offer the people they trust the room to prove them wrong. Dorothy took it. Let me tell you about the spring and summer of 1987, because the work that happened on those 100 acres is the foundation of everything that came after. Dorothy ordered her windbreak seedlings through the Conservation Commission in April. 400 eastern red cedar, 200 Siberian elm, 150 native plum. They arrived in early May as bare root bundles wrapped in damp burlap, and Dorothy and her father planted them by hand over 4 days, working from a string line she had laid out along the eastern boundary. The planting was methodical and unglamorous. You dug a hole, you set the root ball, you tamped the soil, you moved 8 feet down the line and did it again. Dorothy's hands blistered on the second day and she kept going. Her father worked beside her without comment. By the end of the fourth day, 750 seedlings stood in 3 staggered rows along the eastern edge of the farm, each one about 18 inches tall, each one looking in the flat Kansas light like something that might or might not survive the summer. The cover crop went in on the fallow ground in late June, a mix of sorghum, Sudan grass, and hairy vetch that Dorothy had selected for its nitrogen-fixing capacity and its drought tolerance. She planted it at a rate and timing that Dr. Lindgren's research had identified as optimal for termination before fall wheat planting, late enough to build biomass, early enough to be killed by a fall frost without competing with the wheat. Her father watched the planting from the edge of the field and did not say anything, which Dorothy had learned to read as a form of cautious approval. Ray Sievert, farming the section to the east, planted his fallow ground to nothing, as he always had. His 480 acres lay bare through July and August, the soil surface crusting in the heat, the fine particles lifting in the afternoon winds and drifting against his fence lines in pale ridges. He had good stubble management. He had conservation tillage. He had everything Gene Crowley had said he needed. The summer of 1987 in Finney County was not a disaster. It was something more insidious than a disaster. It was a slow, grinding drought that never quite crossed the line into emergency, but that pulled moisture out of the soil every single day through July and August. The wind coming up from the southwest in the afternoons at 25, 30, sometimes 35 miles per hour, the humidity dropping into the single digits by mid-afternoon, the soil temperature on bare fallow ground reaching 140 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface on the worst days. It was the kind of summer that didn't make the news but that showed up in the yield data with brutal clarity. Dorothy's cover crop held the soil on her east 100 acres through all of it. The sorghum Sudan grass grew to 4 feet by mid-August, and when she terminated it with a herbicide application in late September, it left a mat of organic matter on the surface that held moisture like a sponge. Her soil tests in October showed nitrogen levels 22 pounds per acre, higher than the adjacent fallow ground. Her soil moisture at 6 inches was measurably higher than Ray Sievert's comparable ground on the same date. She wrote all of this down in her notebook. The wheat went in on schedule in October. Dorothy's 100 acres on the east side, sheltered from the west by the original windbreak and from the north by the mature cedars, and from the east by the new seedling rows, which were too small to provide real protection yet, but whose presence in the soil was already beginning to matter, emerged uniformly and with vigor that her father noted without comment, but with a look that Dorothy had learned to read as something close to surprise. Ray Sievert's wheat emerged too, patchy in the spots where the summer wind had pulled the finest soil particles away from the seed zone, but adequate. Adequate was the word for most of Finney County that fall. Dorothy's east 100 acres were not adequate. They were, by the numbers she recorded at the end of the season, something better. Let me tell you about the harvest of 1988, because the numbers from that year are the first real verdict in this story. Dorothy's east 100 acres, the sheltered, cover-cropped ground, yielded 47 bushels per acre of winter wheat. The county average that year was 38 bushels per acre. Her father's remaining 380 acres, farmed conventionally with good management, averaged 39 bushels per acre. Ray Sievert's comparable ground averaged 36. At the wheat price of $3.72 per bushel that June, Dorothy's east 100 acres generated revenue of $17,484. The same 100 acres farmed to county average would have generated $14,136. The difference was $3,348 on 100 acres in 1 year. Dorothy wrote the numbers in her notebook and drove to the co-op. She did not make a scene. She did not walk up to Jean Crowley and put the notebook on the counter. She bought a bag of seed treatment and a box of soil test supplies, and she listened to the conversation at the counter, which was about wheat prices and the new farm bill, and whether the cooperative extension was going to hold its summer field day at the usual location. Jean Crowley did not ask Dorothy about her harvest. Ray Sievert, who was also at the counter that morning, looked at her once and then looked away. Dorothy drove home. Her father was waiting for her at the kitchen table. He had the yield records spread out in front of him. His own records, meticulous as always, organized by field and date and variety. He had done the comparison himself. He looked up when Dorothy came in and said, "You were right about the moisture." It was not a full concession. It was not the kind of thing that gets written up in a newspaper. But for Leland Hassel, it was close to a revolution. Dorothy sat down across from him and they went through the numbers together, and by the end of that conversation her father had said 3 words that changed the shape of the operation. "You decide the rotation." Not on the whole farm. Not yet. On the east 100 acres, the ground that had already proven itself, Dorothy Hassel was now the decision-maker. She was 25 years old. Let me tell you about the next 3 years, because proof doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates season by season, like soil building under a cover crop, and you have to be patient enough to let it. In 1988, Dorothy expanded her cover crop program to 200 acres and extended the windbreak seedling planting along the south boundary of the farm. The new trees were still small, 2 and 3 feet tall, but they were alive, all but a handful of the original 750 seedlings having survived their first Kansas summer, which was itself a kind of answer to Jean Crowley's implicit prediction that the whole enterprise was a waste of time and money. She also began soil sampling on a grid pattern across the entire farm, building a baseline data set that Dr. Lindgren, who had become something of a long-distance mentor, helped her interpret. The data showed what she had expected. The sheltered, cover-cropped ground was building organic matter at a measurable rate. The unsheltered, conventionally fallowed ground was not. In 1989, her cover-cropped acres averaged 44 bushels per acre against a county average of 37. The gap was widening. Farmers driving past her fields on the county road began slowing down to look, not because they understood what they were seeing, but because the color of Dorothy's wheat in June, deeper green, more uniform, standing straighter in the wind, was visibly different from the fields on either side. They didn't stop to ask. They looked and drove on, the way people look at something that doesn't fit their understanding of how things work. At the co-op, the subject of Dorothy Hassel's farm came up occasionally in the morning conversations. Jean Crowley's position had evolved from dismissal to a more nuanced form of skepticism. He said more than once that Dorothy had good ground on the east side and that the yield numbers probably reflected the soil more than the management. He said that 2 years was not a long enough sample to draw conclusions. He said that the real test would come in a dry year. He said all of this with the confidence of a man who has been right about enough things that he has earned the right to keep being right, and the farmers at the counter absorbed it in the usual way. Dorothy heard about these conversations secondhand through her mother, who heard them from women whose husbands stood at that counter. She wrote Jean Crowley's objections down in her notebook, not out of anger, but because they were scientifically legitimate, and she intended to answer them with data rather than argument. 2 years was not enough. She needed more. She needed the dry year. In 1990, the new windbreak seedlings along the east and south boundaries were 3 to 4 feet tall and beginning to provide their first meaningful wind reduction. Not the full protection of a mature shelter belt, but measurable. Dorothy's soil organic matter on the cover-cropped acres was now running at 2.8%, compared to 1.9% on the conventionally managed ground. Her father had quietly expanded her management authority to include 300 of the farm's 480 acres. He had not made an announcement about this. He had simply started asking her what she thought before he made decisions, and then doing what she said. Dorothy's mother noticed. Dorothy noticed. Leland Hassel, if he noticed, gave no sign. The 1990 harvest came in at 46 bushels per acre on Dorothy's managed ground, 38 on the county average. Gene Crowley, at the co-op counter, said the same things he had said before. The farmers listened. Some of them were beginning to wonder, quietly, whether Gene was right about Dorothy's ground being naturally better, or whether something else was happening on the Hassel farm. None of them said this out loud. Then 1991 arrived. Let me tell you about the summer of 1991, because it is the year this story stops being about one woman's farm and starts being about what happens when the thing everyone said couldn't happen, happens. The winter of 1990 to 1991 was dry. Not catastrophically dry, but dry enough that the subsoil moisture reserves that southwest Kansas farmers depended on for wheat establishment were below normal going into spring. Then, the spring rains that usually arrived in March and April were late and light. By May, it was clear that Finney County was looking at a serious moisture deficit. By June, the wheat that was standing thin, and the fields that had gone in on bare fallow ground with depleted subsoil moisture were showing stress. The leaves curling at the edges in the afternoon heat, the color going from green to a pale, yellowish green that experienced farmers recognized as the color of a crop that was deciding whether to keep trying. And then, on the 14th of July, the wind came. It came from the southwest, which was where the worst Kansas winds always came from, and it came at 42 miles per hour sustained, with gusts recorded at the Garden City weather station at 57. The humidity at 2 in the afternoon was 4%. The temperature was 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky to the southwest had gone the color of old copper, and by 3 o'clock the dust was moving in walls, not the gentle brown haze of an ordinary windy day, but actual walls of soil, 6 and 8 feet high, rolling across the county in pulses. The fine particles that had been sitting on the surface of bare fallow fields and harvested fields and overgrazed pastures all through the dry spring and early summer, all of it lifting at once. Let me tell you about what that wind did to Finney County, because the numbers are the only way to understand the scale of what happened. Ray Sievert lost 4 inches of topsoil from his most exposed fields in a single afternoon. 4 inches. The soil that had taken, by conservative geological estimate, somewhere between 400 and 800 years to build, was gone in an afternoon. His fence lines were buried to the top wire on the north and east sides. His equipment shed had a drift of soil against the south wall that reached the eave. His wheat stubble, which had been providing some surface protection, was not enough. The wind found the bare patches, the headlands, the low spots where the stubble was thin, the corners where the equipment had turned too many times, and it pulled the soil up and carried it northeast, toward the Arkansas River, toward Oklahoma, toward wherever the wind decided it was going. Across the county, the story was the same. Fields that had been farmed conventionally, with bare summer fallow and no windbreak protection, lost measurable topsoil. The county extension agent would later estimate that the average loss across unprotected fields in the affected area was between 2 and 3 inches of A-horizon soil. At a conservative estimate of 300 tons of soil per acre inch, that was 600 to 900 tons of topsoil per acre. Gone in an afternoon. Dorothy Hassel's farm did not lose topsoil. Her cover crop residue on the managed acres held the soil surface through the entire event. The organic matter she'd been building for 4 years acted as a binding agent, holding the fine particles together against the wind. And the windbreak, the 40-foot cedars on the north and west that Jean Crowley had told her were a relic of a different era. The 10-year-old trees on the south that her grandfather had planted because the ground was blowing away. The 4-year-old seedlings on the east that were now 5 feet tall and beginning to close their canopy. The windbreak reduced wind speed across her sheltered ground by an amount that her anemometer, which she had installed the previous year at Dr. Lindgren's suggestion, recorded with precision. At the peak of the storm, the wind speed at the center of her most sheltered field was 19 miles per hour. Across the fence on Ray Sievert's ground, it was 44. Dorothy walked her fields the morning after the storm. The soil surface was intact. Her cover crop residue was matted down by the wind, but still in place. The new seedlings on the east boundary had lost some small branches, but were standing. The mature cedars on the north and west had not moved. She walked to the fence line between her farm and Ray Sievert's and looked at the drift of soil against the fence posts. Finney County topsoil, dark and fine, piled against her fence because it had been stopped there, because the windbreak had caught it, because the ground on her side had held while the ground on his side had let go. She stood at that fence for a long time. Then she went home and wrote the numbers in her notebook. The 1991 harvest told the rest of the story. Dorothy's managed acres, despite the drought, despite the stress, despite everything the summer had thrown at southwest Kansas, yielded 39 bushels per acre. The county average was 24. Ray Sievert's comparable ground yielded 21. The per-acre revenue difference between Dorothy's managed ground and the county average, at that year's wheat price of $3 per bushel, was $45 per acre. On her 300 managed acres, that was $13,500 in additional revenue compared to county average performance. Compared to Ray Sievert's ground next door, the difference was $54 per acre, or $16,200 on 300 acres. But the number that Dorothy wrote in red ink at the top of the page was not the revenue number, it was the soil number. The county had lost, on average, between 600 and 900 tons of topsoil per acre in the July storm. Dorothy's farm had lost, by her measurement and Dr. Lindgren's subsequent analysis, less than 20 tons per acre on the sheltered ground and essentially zero on the cover-cropped acres. The soil that her neighbors had lost would take centuries to replace. The soil on her farm was still there. That was not a one-year advantage. That was a permanent one. Her father said nothing for 3 days after the harvest numbers came in. On the 4th day, he came to Dorothy at the kitchen table and sat down and said, "You were right. Not about the moisture, not about the rotation, about all of it. About the windbreak and the cover crops and the soil and what her grandfather had understood in 1931 that the county had apparently forgotten by 1987. Leland Hassel was not a man who said those words easily. Dorothy knew that. She did not make him say anything else. Let me tell you about what happened at the co-op in the fall of 1991, because the story does not end at the fence line. Gene Crowley heard about Dorothy's harvest numbers the way everyone in a small county hears about everything. Gradually, through conversations at the elevator and the feed store and the coffee counter, each telling adding a detail or subtracting one, until the story had been through enough hands that it was both more and less than the truth. What survived all the telling was the core of it. Dorothy Hassel's farm had come through the July storm intact. Her yields were more than 50% above the county average in a drought year. Her soil was still there. Gene Crowley did not come to Dorothy's farm in the fall of 1991. He came in the spring of 1992, on a Tuesday morning in March, driving his pickup down the county road and turning into the Hassel Lane without calling ahead, which was either the custom of the country or the behavior of a man who had not yet decided how to frame what he was about to do. Dorothy was in the machine shed when she heard the truck. She came out wiping her hands on a shop rag and found Gene Crowley standing in the yard, looking at the windbreak. He was looking at it the way a man looks at something he has been wrong about for a long time. Not with anger or embarrassment, but with a kind of careful attention, as if he is trying to understand exactly where his thinking had gone sideways. He said, "I want to know about the cover crop program." Dorothy looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Gene, you told me in 1987 that cover crops on fallow ground would rob moisture from my wheat. You said it in front of 4 other farmers, and you said it like it was settled science." Gene Crowley said, "I know what I said. My soil moisture at 6 inches was higher going into fall planting on the cover-cropped acres than on any comparable bare fallow ground in the county. Every year for 4 years. I have the data." Gene said, "I'd like to see it." Dorothy looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Come inside." She brought the notebook to the kitchen table. Not the current one, but the original, the one she had brought home from K-State in 1987. The one with Dr. Lindgren's data and the evapotranspiration tables and the yield projections that she had presented to her father at this same table 5 years earlier. She opened it to the first page and set it in front of Gene Crowley and let him read. He read for a long time. He asked questions. Good questions, the questions of a man who understood agriculture and was genuinely trying to understand what he was looking at. Dorothy answered them without editorializing. She showed him the soil test data, the yield records, the anemometer readings from the July storm, the comparison with Ray Sievert's ground. She showed him the soil loss estimates. She showed him the revenue comparisons year by year from 1988 through 1991. When he was done, Gene Crowley sat back in his chair and looked at the notebook for a moment. Then he said, "What's the best cover crop mix for a farm that's been in continuous wheat fallow for 30 years?" Dorothy said, "That depends on your soil type and your fall planting window. What's your ground like?" And they talked for 2 hours. Let me tell you about what happened in Finney County over the following decade, because the story doesn't end at the kitchen table either. Dorothy Hassel began offering informal consultations to neighboring farmers in the spring of 1992. Not as a business, she was still farming full-time, but because the questions started coming and she answered them. Ray Sievert came to her that spring, hat in hand, with questions about cover crop establishment on ground that had lost its topsoil. She helped him. She helped 3 other farmers that year, and 8 the year after, and by 1995 she'd been asked to present her data at the Finney County Extension Service's annual field day, standing at a podium in front of 140 farmers, most of whom had heard her name in connection with the 1991 storm and the yield numbers that had come out of it. Her father sat in the 3rd row. When she finished presenting, he stood up. He did not say anything. He just stood up, and the farmers around him understood what it meant, and several of them stood up too, and then most of the room was standing, and Dorothy Hassel stood at the podium and looked at the room and did not cry, because she was her father's daughter and her grandfather's granddaughter, and the Hassels did not cry at field days. She said, "The lesson here is not that windbreaks are magic. The lesson is that any farm that treats its soil as a resource to be mined rather than a system to be maintained is a farm that is one bad summer away from losing what it cannot replace." My grandfather understood that. The Dust Bowl taught him. We forgot the lesson. The July storm reminded us. I hope we don't need another reminder. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Gene Crowley, sitting in the 7th row, started clapping. And the room followed. By 1997, 31 farms in Finney County had established new windbreaks through the Conservation Commission's tree program, most of them with Dorothy's direct assistance in planning and species selection. 17 farms had adopted some form of cover cropping on their summer fallow ground. The county extension agent, a man who had told Dorothy in 1987 that removing her windbreak would give her 11 more tillable acres, wrote her a letter in 1996 acknowledging that his advice had been wrong and that the data from her farm had changed his thinking on windbreak management in semi-arid environments. Dorothy kept the letter. She did not frame it. She put it in the notebook. Dr. Lindgren came to Finney County in the summer of 1998 to see the farm. He was 64 years old and had been studying windbreaks for 30 years, and he walked the boundaries of the Hassel farm in the morning light and looked at the mature east and south shelter belts, the trees that had been 18-inch seedlings when Dorothy planted them in 1987. Now 12 and 15 feet tall, their canopy beginning to close, their root systems deep in the Kansas hardpan. And he said, "Your grandfather was right." Dorothy said, "I know." He said, "Most people never figure that out until it's too late." Dorothy said, "Some people need a storm." Let me tell you about the morning Dorothy found her grandfather's planting records, because the story has one more layer and you need to know it. In the winter of 1999, Dorothy was going through a box of her grandfather's papers that had been stored in the attic of the farmhouse since his death in 1974. The box contained farm records, seed catalogs, a few letters, and a small notebook. Not unlike Dorothy's own, though older, the cover worn smooth and the pages yellowed. Her grandfather, a man named Otto Hassel, had planted the original windbreak in 1931 and 1932 during the worst years of the Dust Bowl, and he had kept records of the planting the way Dorothy kept records of everything: species, spacing, survival rates, cost per seedling, source of the trees. He had gotten his seedlings through the same Conservation Commission tree program that Dorothy had used 56 years later. The seedlings had cost him $4.20 per hundred. At the back of the notebook, in the careful handwriting of a man who had grown up speaking German and learned English as a working language, Otto Hassel had written a note. It was not addressed to anyone in particular. It said, "The trees will outlast the arguments against them. Plant them anyway." Dorothy sat with that notebook for a long time. Then she went downstairs and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table where she had presented her data to her father in 1987. And she thought about Otto Hassel planting trees in 1931 while the soil blew off his fields. And she thought about Gene Crowley laughing at the co-op counter in 1987. And she thought about the July storm and the fence line and the drift of Finney County topsoil piled against her posts. And she thought about the 31 farms that now had new windbreaks and the 17 farms that now had cover crops and the extension agent's letter in her notebook, and she thought about her father standing up in the third row. She wrote, "Plant them anyway," on the first page of her current notebook. Below Otto's quote, she wrote the date, January 14th, 1999. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story has a final chapter, and it happened on a Sunday afternoon in the spring of 2003. Dorothy was 40 years old. She'd been farming the Hassel place for 16 years. The windbreaks were mature on 3 sides of the farm now. The east and south shelter belts she had planted in 1987 and 1988, now standing 20 feet tall, their canopy providing the full protection that Dr. Lindgren's models had predicted. The farm's organic matter was averaging 3.4% across the managed acres. Her 5-year average yield was 51 bushels per acre against a county average of 41. She had been asked to serve on the Kansas State Conservation Commission's advisory board, which she had accepted. She had been asked to write a chapter for a USDA publication on windbreak management in semi-arid environments, which she had also accepted, citing Dr. Lindgren's research and her own 16 years of data. On that Sunday afternoon, her daughter, a 17-year-old named Hazel, who had spent every harvest of her life on the Hassel farm, and who had, in the past year, been reading her great-great-grandfather Otto's notebook and her mother's notebooks with the focused attention of someone who is trying to understand something important, came to Dorothy at the kitchen table with a proposal. She had been reading about hemp production, industrial hemp, which had been federally prohibited since 1937, and which Kansas was in the early stages of considering for pilot production programs. The research Hazel had found, from Colorado State, from the University of Kentucky's Extension Service, from a Canadian agricultural research station that had been growing hemp legally for years, suggested that industrial hemp was exceptionally well suited to semi-arid environments, that its deep taproot system built soil organic matter at rates comparable to or exceeding legume cover crops, that its fiber and seed markets were developing rapidly, and that a farm with established windbreak protection and high soil organic matter, a farm, in other words, exactly like the Hassel place, would be positioned to produce hemp at yields and quality levels that conventional farms could not match. Hazel had a notebook. It was not unlike Dorothy's original notebook from K-State. It had data tables and research citations and a planting plan and projected revenue comparisons. She set it on the kitchen table in front of her mother. Dorothy looked at the notebook for a moment. She looked at her daughter. She thought about Otto Hassel planting trees in 1931 while people told him the wind would stop. She thought about Gene Crowley's laugh at the co-op counter. She thought about standing at the fence line the morning after the July storm, looking at the drift of other people's soil piled against her posts. She said, "Show me the data." Hazel opened the notebook. Dorothy leaned forward, and outside the kitchen window, the windbreak her grandfather had planted in 1931 stood in the March light, the cedars dark and permanent against the flat Kansas sky, their roots reaching down into the hardpan, their canopy breaking the wind that came off the southwest, doing what they had always done, what they were built to do, what Otto Hassel had understood they would do when he pressed the first seedling into the ground with his hands while the soil blew off his fields, and everyone around him was trying to figure out how to survive the present rather than build the future. Dorothy Hassel still farms those 480 acres. The windbreaks are 50 years old on the north and west sides and 36 years old on the east and south. The soil organic matter is 4.1%. The county average is 2.3. She keeps her grandfather's notebook in the top drawer of the kitchen desk next to her own. The Conservation Commission estimates that the Hassel Farms windbreaks have prevented the loss of an estimated 180,000 tons of topsoil since 1987. Soil that is still there, still building, still holding. Gene Crowley retired in 1998. He came to Dorothy's farm one more time before he moved to Wichita to be near his daughter, and he stood in the yard and looked at the windbreaks for a long time. He said, "Your grandfather was a smart man." Dorothy said, "He was. He also had good timing." Gene said, "So did you." He shook her hand and got in his truck and drove down the county road, and Dorothy watched him go, and then she went back to work. She planted the trees in a wheat county. They laughed. The storm came. The wheat died. The trees held. And the soil that her grandfather saved in 1931 and that Dorothy saved in 1987 is still there. Plant them anyway.